This movie's seeds were planted way back in 2004 during the production of X2, with Fox wanting an X-Men spin-off movie and hiring Sheldon Turner to draft it. The script he penned was about Magneto and was set to follow Eric attempting to survive Auschwitz and see where Eric and Charles differ. Would have been a pretty mental movie from the sounds of it. David S. Goyer was hired to direct in 2007, but due to varying circumstances at the time, all plans for the film were cancelled. Eventually, after Kinberg, long-term producer of the X-Men movies, read the First Class comics, he pitched developing a movie based on the comics but not strictly sticking to that run, because he didn't think it was that great, but he thought it could be a good thing to base off. The original plan was to wait and see how X-Men Origins Magneto does, and then decide whether to greenlight it, but that movie was waiting to see how X-Men Origins Wolverine did. So not an ideal start. Josh Schwartz was hired to write a screenplay and Fox approached Singer to direct, but apparently Singer didn't like the script, so he wrote his own treatment, which was then developed later into a new script by Jamie Moss. In 2009, though it was said that the Magneto Origins movie might not be made and has been put at the back of the queue, more focus had been shifted onto First Class, and Singer denied using Turner's Magneto script as inspiration for his draft, but Turner was still credited for the movie, whereas Moss and Schwartz's contributions were left uncredited. Eventually, Matthew Vaughn was contacted to direct in 2010, despite not initially considering him, as he'd already backed out of The Last Stand. But with the opportunity to reboot the X-Men his way, and it be set in the 60s, he agreed, and it became official in May 2010, and Fox announced a June 3rd, 2011 release date. Vaughn was also going to be rewriting the script himself. Time was so short on this project, he had even less time than he did on The Last Stand, which was a big factor as to why he dropped out, and somehow he still managed to cook up a storm with this movie. Vaughn was quoted saying, "I got my cake and ate it. Managed to do an X-Men movie and a Bond thing and a Frankenheimer political thriller at the same time." Of the mainline X-Men movies, so not including the Deadpool and Wolverine films, this is probably my favourite. We get an extended version of that great opening from the first X-Men movie, and it parallels where we see Charles so well, in his mansion, literally stating he has enough food so that Raven never has to steal again, as opposed to Eric being exploited by Sebastian Shaw, Kevin Bacon's character, who is great as the villain in this film. He portrays excellently a character who just lacks empathy entirely, and we instantly see the roots of Magneto as he is exploited due to being a mutant, with Shaw killing his mother in an attempt for pain and anger to trigger Eric's power, and it does. The grief and overwhelming anger and pain causes Magneto's power to just unleash, and that's where it all started. Now, before we go any further, I want to say certain films have sauce. Just certain directors to certain movies bring the sauce, and I don't know if you'll know what I mean. A lot of films, especially the later MCU movies, don't have much sauce. They're just films. We see them as films, but this film has the sauce. This little scene revealing Magneto years later that he's been tracking Shaw, that little guitar soundtrack, the visuals of the scene, the coin in between his fingers. Playing this scene, surely you get what I mean by that Matthew Vaughn has brought the sauce. It's such a little scene and it doesn't have to go so hard. It actually portrays Charles as a bit of a dick at times. The way his and Eric's lives parallel until they meet, and then they diverge, is the heart of the film and why it's so good. Those two and where they differ is what really allows us to be invested in both characters and understand their views and why their methods are so different. The way Raven, or Mystique, is struggling to come to terms with herself, feeling unable to be true and feeling hurt by the fact Charles can just use his ability as he pleases without judgment or people even noticing, because she can't. This is a world that doesn't know about mutants, or at least very few people do. It's just theories and speculation amongst small groups of people, and so Charles wants to keep Raven protected and hidden, which is understandable. Yet despite this, Charles is pretty dismissive of Raven's feelings, especially when she asks if he'd date her, and he initially says yes, but backtracks as soon as she stands there in her real form. What a dick. In terms of her showing herself in public though, that at least makes sense because, as I say, the world doesn't know about mutants and they aren't particularly accepted in the modern day, let alone the 60s. But the film doesn't let Charles get away with being a dick, like it's very aware of that. Also, he's kind of a stud. The first act culminates in Eric and Charles meeting, coming at the issue of Shaw with the same goal, but from literal opposite directions. Eric is following his rage and out for blood, whereas Charles has arrived with a plan with the CIA, because yeah, as I say, this film really gets to be a political thriller, and it's great at it. Moira McTaggart has just learned about mutants and that they're somehow involved in the threat of a World War III. Shaw and his accomplices are trying to place missiles in just the right spot in Cuba that it would seem like they're declaring a war, and a nuclear war. Military officials are obviously trying to avoid this, including the CIA, so Moira brings in Charles. But the thing is, Shaw has connections, he has the power to be making these things happen. The scene in the meeting room is great, and this film balances its tone really well. It manages to keep incredibly grounded despite having such wacky story elements and characters.
Splendid.
But it's also never taking itself too seriously. It's absolutely embracing the fun of the comics. That sequence on Shaw's boat is truly great though. Charles' first meeting with Eric, saving him, revealing to him that he's not alone. Charles just feeling that soul in the water, needing help, and just going straight in himself. It's a great scene, and it's a great introduction to their newfound relationship that will spawn from this moment. And it's a great scene from the action point of view. Eric throwing that chain and using practical effects to do so for a few moments of it is awesome. Eric is prepared to die to avenge his mother, but the size of the sub is too much for Eric to withhold. And if he keeps trying, he's going to drown. He has to let him go, so Charles drags him away, and that's where Eric realizes that he's not alone. McAvoy and Fassbender are crazy good in these roles and have an incredible relationship in the movie. Their chemistry is great, their dynamic is the highlight of each of these prequel movies. They're taken to a CIA base where Charles accidentally outs Hank as a mutant who hadn't revealed it to his co-workers, but I love how excited Charles is to meet another mutant. I love how Hank and Raven connect over their appearances. Both just want to be accepted, and it's a really emotional subject that so many people can relate to. It really ties them together, and it's fascinating to see the routes they go down. Despite Raven growing up with Charles and Hank only just meeting him, by the end of the movie, Raven sides with Eric, whereas Hank with Charles, and it's representative of both of their growths in the movie. The scene also just shows the love triangle that's going to arise with Eric getting in between the two of them already.
Kinky.
We get an early version of Cerebro, which is great. It looks amazing. I love the 60s like aesthetic and how retro it feels is the only word that comes to mind. And it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. It's truly stunning, and it's thrilling to see it used for the first time. Charles pushing his mental ability, and using Cerebro, they're able to find and recruit other mutants to help against Shaw. They're building a bit of a team, and we get such a great montage with a great Hugh Jackman cameo.
Excuse me, I'm Eric Lensher.
Charles Xavier.
Go fuck yourself.
And this all leads to all these younger mutants testing their powers and stuff at the CIA base where they're left. It's a pretty clear way to just get some exposition out and find out about these characters, but it's also just a really fun scene, and it's very realistic that this would happen. I mean, they're young adults as is, but they're mutants with powers that have all discovered that they're not alone in the world, and are just sitting around and waiting. But then the storm on this CIA base is very tense, but very fun stuff. As I said, Kevin Bacon is awesome and just so powerful in the film, and it's a really fun attack sequence causing absolute destruction with the teleporter Hazazel just literally making it rain with people by dropping them out of the sky. Shaw claims that he wants them to join him on his quest to make mutants the dominant species.
Be enslaved.
That's gotta be racist.
He wants to be a god as he feels they are the next step in human evolution. But also, if they don't take this action, he knows that mutants are at risk of being wiped out. This is why he's trying to set up a World War III, because he can consume all that nuclear energy as well, and use that himself to do badass shit with his powers. So it would all come together in his favour and end with him leading the world, and with mutants as the dominant species. Angel decides to go with Shaw, feeling that she's been controlled all her life and felt below others all her life, and so doesn't want to feel that anymore. But the rest of the gang attempt to stop Shaw and the others, but Shaw absorbs Havoc's energy blast and kills Darwin. And it is a little bit ironic that the one character who supposedly can't die is the one who dies here, but I think it's a genuinely quite emotional scene for these characters. It's a real moment of realization of how serious this is, especially for how young they are, and it kind of just hammers home how powerful Shaw is. With this, they realize they need a location change, as the CIA base is clearly compromised, so this leads us to the X-Mansion. The ensuing training montage is a lot of fun. Seeing the banter between all the different guys creates a really great team dynamic, Charles and Eric obviously highlighting it. And this whole sequence culminates in the scene with Charles and Eric facing the satellite. Charles had before refused to shoot a gun at Eric's head, which is also a great moment where Eric is so overconfident that he can stop the bullet before it hits him, but Charles turns that around on him, and even if he does believe that, then he's not pushing himself. So it leads to Charles pushing Eric to move the satellite, but Eric can't do it, it's too much, same as when he tried to lift the sub. So Charles taps into Eric's mind, viewing a memory of him and his mother, which brings both men to tears. Eric is so convinced that it's the pain and anger that allows him to use his power, but Charles proves that's not the case, bringing up a positive memory which does then give Eric the strength to move the satellite. All his life he's been consumed with pain and anger, and he'd even forgot he had such memories like this. And it's a really beautiful scene for the characters of Charles trying to show that there's so much more underneath what Eric believes about himself. The scene with Hank and Raven is a real tragic one. Hank has made what he thinks is a cure for the visual effects of their mutations, meaning that they'll still have their powers, but they just won't look different. And this has been a big subject, as I mentioned, throughout the film. However, when Hank offers the cure, Raven now believes they shouldn't have to hide. Through meeting more mutants, as well as particularly Eric's influence, who sees how Raven hides and is encouraging her to be herself, she's become more comfortable and more confident and more happy in herself. However, is still extremely conscious about what others think and the fact that she feels different. Hank obviously is really excited to be able to fit in, to not feel judged, and especially to have that life with Raven. But Hank is hurt by Raven's change of heart and feels much more isolated as a result. There's so much love here between both characters. They both truly care and love each other, but Raven's confidence is then also shaken due to Hank's frustrated reaction, but Raven is finally starting to feel mutant and proud. The scene where Raven joins Eric in bed is representative of his influence, only accepting her advances when she's in her natural form.
Perfection.
While it's never really taken or focused on anywhere in the sequel in terms of their romantic relationship, other than brief moments, I like this foundation of their relationship anyway. And I think their arcs across the film complement each other really well, and so this works for me. It's not a big romantical subplot, it's more about the core emotions of the characters, and they're just connecting here. Charles and Eric are then seen playing chess, as is usual for these characters, keeping consistent with the originals and representative of their relationship. I think it works really well in this scene, just as we're heading into the final act, and they don't even know it yet, but their ideologies are clashing in how to deal with this threat, and that is what defines these two. They're so close, yet they fall so far apart. We enter the final act with these beautiful yellow suits, and we find Hank has turned into the Beast. The injection did not work, it enhanced the mutant cells. I don't hate the makeup for Beast, but it is absolutely way too bulky, and you don't feel much of Holt's performance, and it feels quite staggered, which is a bit of a shame, especially having such a great Beast in Last Stand. You can't help but feel a step back from that. And the final act, admittedly, is probably the weakest part of the movie. It just doesn't have that grand satisfaction that I think the movie had kind of earned. But the scene as Eric lifts the submarine is such a great moment. It's representative of where he's come from since the start of the movie and the effect that Charles has had on him. The newfound control and understanding over his pain, as well as being a really fun and triumphant scene just in itself. And it's great to see all the different members of the team and the opposing side using their powers in fun ways. It is kind of just Beast that feels a little bit out of place. And then Raven doesn't get a whole lot to do until kind of a little moment towards the end. The void on the submarine is a visually spectacular room. The face-off between Shaw and Eric is great stuff too. The actors are great opposite each other and it's truly tense, and the blue glass and the yellow suits contrast amazingly, and it's just a great action scene. Eric allows himself to be thrown around, smashing the glass, allowing Charles to get through with his powers. We've caught glimpses throughout the movie, so having this final confrontation take place in here is great. The entire shipwreck sub looks great, it's a great setting. And now we reach the climactic moment of the movie. It is absolutely batshit insane how this movie goes from goofy comic book shit to this absolute banger of a scene. Eric allows that pain and anger to consume him in this final moment, and despite all the way he's come, those early moments are so ingrained into his mind. It's the only way he believes he can handle this situation, and it's his foundation, because Shaw did that. Taking Shaw's helmet as well to block Charles out, Eric's final chess move goes against Charles, and this is where they split. The slow move past Shaw's head as Eric forces the coin through, intercut with Charles screaming in pain. Not only is he feeling the actual pain, seen as Charles is in Shaw's head, freezing him, the pain of seeing and feeling Eric, his friend, his brother, choosing this path. Also, obviously, Eric mirrors Shaw's quote at the start of the movie. Then after this, the humans actually fire the missiles at the beach, and I think this is really interesting actually, because it kind of frames Eric as right. It doesn't frame his solution as right, but his ideology, or at least his anxieties. He believed that humans would turn on them upon discovering, and he was correct.
Sure, us, they won't differentiate. They'll fear us. And that fear will turn to hatred.
They saw these powerful people and immediately threw nuclear missiles at them. It's also incredibly representative of the time I think the film is set in, because it is a much more judgmental society at this time. The fight ensues between Eric and Charles, which feels so desperate from both, neither wanting to fight at all. They both look like they hate this, and it's sad to watch. Then Eric deflecting a bullet that lands right into Charles' back, paralyzing him. It's a really emotional scene where the two realize they've chosen different paths, and Eric's reaction to McTaggart, it proves the fact that Eric has chosen to still allow his pain to push him forward, and Charles is heartbroken and angry. He loses Raven as well, and it's really great stuff. It's a great ending for these characters in the movie. It's a great climactic moment. The battle on the beach ends with Eric holding out his hand to Raven and the others, mirroring Shaw's actions at the CIA base earlier, cementing that the fact Eric chose this path means more than anything he's just replaced Shaw, and then parts ways with Charles for good. Until the next movie. Now we finally end with Eric breaking out Emma Frost in a goofy ass helmet, which is a little too silly to end on, but the final scene that came before with Charles and Moira is a nice bridge into building the X-Men, and you know, it's fine. No one expected First Class to work, I don't think, let alone be in the debate for quite a few fans of the best X-Men movie. This film does so well at creating such interesting characters with unique ideologies and beliefs, and how that can clash even with the best intentions and same goals in mind, even if they want the same thing. And it really leaves it up to you to decide who you think is right, because it goes so in depth in how they feel and their childhood and why they are the way they are, and I find that fascinating, and I find myself incredibly invested in this film. Obviously we have antagonists and protagonists, but it's just not as plain black and white. Also, despite the original intention as this was made of being a reboot, it actually stays pretty true to the original trilogy. It's only the later movies where it completely fucks it up, but this film is also not at all held down by the originals. Like there's some like retcons and inconsistencies, like the fact that Charles and Mystique's relationship is so poignant and they don't even interact, I don't think, in the original 3 movies. Whilst it stays true to those original 3, it's still entirely its own entity. Days of Future Past would carry on the great story set up here, as well as tying it into the original trilogy in a great way. But First Class is a very focused movie, very character driven, with a plot that ties into real events of the Cuban Missile Crisis and uses that to create the world and get us invested in that world that isn't aware of the existence of mutants. This creates the heightened anxiety for these characters. There's a lot at stake here, personally and globally. Outside of Logan, I think this is probably my favourite X-Men movie. I'm not sure what the general consensus is on this film, so maybe that's a hot take, maybe it's not. But if you haven't seen this film or you haven't watched it in a while, I highly recommend giving it a visit or a revisit.